Hello Internet, my name is Quinn and this is Blondihacks. Today I'm going to do a much requested video. This is a long-term report or review, if you like, on the PM-728 milling machine that I've had for a couple of years now. Before that I had the PM25, so I can kind of compare and contrast the two a little bit for you. Now, full disclosure, I did not pay retail for that machine. Precision Matthews sent me that mill, but it was not a sponsorship deal. It was very much a no strings attached. We just like your channel, no doubt because I've completely unintentionally sold a lot of their hardware over the years just by using it on my channel. I've never had any kind of arrangement with them. They just offered to send me the mill as a thank you. No strings, no review required, no video or anything like that. And look, I'm not going to say no to a free milling machine of that caliber. So hopefully you don't feel like that biases my review, but I am going to give you my honest opinion, all the thorns included, on what I think about that machine right now. This video is going to be about my experiences long-term with the 728 for sure, and I'm also going to be comparing it a lot to the PM25, which is the mill that I had before this for a number of years. What this is not going to be is a marketplace comparison against all the other hobby mills out there, the Siegs and the Grizzlies and what have you. I often get asked about that. People send me a link to some mill on some site that they found and they ask me, is this a good one? And unfortunately, I just don't know. I am not a marketplace expert on small hobby machine tools. I have literally only owned 2 milling machines. I have owned this one and I have owned the PM25. I have barely even run any milling machines other than those 2. I've run a couple of other ones at trade shows here and there, but really my only substantial experience with milling machines is these 2. I am not a machinist. I am a hack in a rural garage in the middle of nowhere, fooling around with stuff, building steam engines. So I will tell you what I can about these machines, but I can't do a vast marketplace analysis for you, I'm afraid. I want to start with the single biggest advantage that I think this machine has over the PM25 and over, frankly, a lot of the hobby milling field, and that's Z height. This machine has quite a lot of it for, again, this size range of machine. I mean, from the top of the vise here to the bottom of the spindle, you know, that's 11 and a half inches, let's call it. And that's pretty amazing. I mean, that's, I forget exactly what the PM25 had, but I think this is easily 40, maybe 50% more. And this is a very important measurement on a hobby mill because these mills are small and you are going to be limited by their size in many ways, but the number one way that you will be limited is Z height. And this might seem like a lot of space, and it is, but by the time you get a workpiece in here and a drill chuck in here and let's say a long reamer in here, boy, that space goes away fast. And this is probably the number one area where I struggled with the PM25 was Z real estate. So there are some ways around that though. I don't want that to turn you off buying the PM25, for example, or a machine like it if that's your budget. You should spend your budget, obviously. So you can make it work with this real estate. The top survival method there is stubby drills, or what's often called screw machine length drills. So this is a number 1 screw machine length drill compared to a standard jobber drill. You can see how much shorter that is. You know, that's a good, I don't know, 4 or 5 centimeters shorter, and that's a big deal. This amount of real estate can be the whole ball game because, like, that's often your workpiece right there, that much sticking up above the vise. So these really, really help. But the thing that is going to get you with Z real estate really is reamers because, oops, let's just put that back. So reamers are long, and they are supposed to be long because they're supposed to be flexible, because they're supposed to follow the hole that's already there, which you may not be perfectly aligned with, because the reamer's job is not to try and move that hole, it's to dimension it and to make it round. So reamers are always long so that they have some flex in them. Now, there are stubby reamers. This is a stubby half-inch reamer. So a standard half-inch reamer, I don't have one to show you, but is probably almost twice as long as this. So this is a stubby. These used to be easier to get. They're becoming harder and harder to get because, again, most people don't want them because you want your reamers to be long and flexible. But there are some other options for working around these as well. The most common way that I worked around this problem was to put my reamers in collets rather than drill chucks. However, this is harder than it sounds because They're called chucking reamers for a reason. They're designed to be put in Jacob's chucks. And what that means is the shanks on them are all weird sizes. You know, a set of standard imperial reamers you might think would all have 1/4, 3/8, or 1/2 inch shanks, but they don't. The shanks are all, frankly, random sizes. Whatever's helpful for the manufacturing process, I guess. They don't put any effort into making the shanks a standard size. Now, most of the time, they're close enough to some imperial collet that you might have, or often there's a metric collet kind of in between a couple of imperial sizes that will work, and vice versa. For metric reamers, you might find an imperial collet that's close enough to work, and I was able to make that work often enough that I was always able to ream when I needed to, and there was one time when I took a standard reamer and cut the shank down because I had no other choice. But that's, you know, so there are options. It was mostly an inconvenience. It never fully stopped me from making anything, that I had to try and find a way to put my reamers in collets, but it did mean a lot more tool changing and a lot more fooling around. So having enough Z height to get all of your reamers in a drill chuck is a huge advantage. The other main Z height survival trick is to work directly on the table and forego the vise. If I was working on a part on my smaller mill that I knew was going to have a lot of reamers involved, or other long tooling, like boring heads is another one where tool height was often a problem, I would kind of look ahead at the operations, bring in all my tooling and make sure that everything was going to clear, and if it wasn't, then I would take the vise off and work directly on the table, and that buys you, you know, quite a bit of extra Z height. Like this distance here is easily the difference between, you know, using stubby reamers and not, or using a drill chuck or not in the spindle for your reamers. So I got pretty good at working directly on the table on the PM25. I did it a lot more often than I do now. Another question I sometimes get asked is, would a smaller mill actually be better for smaller parts? Because I do mostly small things, as you know, if you watch my channel. And that's an excellent question. I think there is a lot of value in matching the size of your machine tools to the size of your work. You know, there's an old machinist expression that you can make small parts on a big lathe, but you can't make big parts on a small lathe. And that's one of those things that's like technically true, but is sort of useless information, because while you can make screws for your wristwatch on a giant lathe, it's an awful lot of trouble to do that. It's much easier to make those parts on a lathe that's designed for making parts that size. And the same is largely true here. If you don't need all of the real estate and flexibility of, say, a Bridgeport, it's a lot less work and it's a lot more efficient to make these small parts on a machine like this, because all of the slides are handy and easy to move. The drawbar is easy to get to. Like, you can make, you know, model steam engine parts on a 6-ton Cleveland mill, but if you need a step ladder to get to the drawbar on that mill, boy, you're going to get tired of doing that. So these small machines are very efficient. Everything's nice and easy and quick to get around. You aren't spending nearly as much time and effort on setups and moving slides around and so on. You know, one of the most common things you do on a milling machine is move the spindle up and down. And doing that on a small column head mill is a lot less effort, physical effort, and fooling around than cranking up and down the giant knee on a Bridgeport. That's a lot of physical work, and you do it a lot. So if you don't need to do that because your machine is better matched to the size of parts you're making, all the better. Now, that said, the difference between this machine and the PM25 is not enough for that really to be a factor. On the two mills, the table is the same size, the spindle is the same horsepower. There's no appreciable difference there. What is different and what matters more is the range of spindle RPMs for making small parts. That's again where a small mill is better for making small stuff than a big mill is, because big mills typically have an upper limit on RPM somewhere in the like 1500 to 2000 range. But if you're making small parts with tiny drills, you need a lot of spindle RPM sometimes. And this machine will go to 4400 RPM. And that's such an advantage when making, you know, when drilling these tiny drills in especially things like aluminum and brass, where you really need that surface speed. And so this thing is great for that. And it's also a big advantage over the PM25. The PM25 maxed out at, I think, 2500 RPM. So that 4400 RPM upper spindle limit on this mill is a huge advantage for making small stuff. Now, none of these small mills are good at the low end, and that's the other reason that people often think they aren't going to be good, because if you're making large parts, You want the opposite. You want low-end torque, right? You're going to be using big cutters running at 100 RPM, and you need a lot of torque to move those cutters. A mill like this cannot do that. You cannot run a 6-inch face mill in this thing. Like, you really don't want to be using cutters larger than about 3/4 of an inch in diameter because it just doesn't have the torque. I mean, the spindle will run at 50 RPM or 100 RPM, but it's brushless DC. It doesn't have any torque at that low RPM. It doesn't really have any usable torque until somewhere around 250 RPM. Now, I have run it as slow as 100 sometimes if I'm doing something that doesn't need a lot of torque. But yeah, you're really not going to be using large diameter cutters on this kind of machine because of that. Aside from Z height, I would say the other main advantage to this mill over the PM25 is the quality of the slides. Now, the ones on the PM25 are fine. I used that mill for 5 years and had no trouble with it. They're perfectly fine. They're standard machined ways of the type you find at that price point in all sorts of markets, and they work just fine. This machine, though, the ways are just a little bit of a step above. Like, they're ground and scraped in, and you do feel it. Like, the slides on this thing are much, much smoother and nicer than on the PM25. And again, it's not enough. It's not going to affect your work. It doesn't affect what kinds of things you can do or the quality of your work. Both of these machines deliver excellent surface finishes if your speeds and feeds are right. None of this stuff really matters for the work, but it's just kind of a quality of life thing. The slides on this thing are really, really nice, and they move really nicely, and it's a little bit more of a pleasure to use it because of that. Is that worth the price difference? I don't know. Probably not, honestly, if that was the only difference. Another area where the 728 really wins over the 25 is on Y travel. The PM25 was strangely limited in the amount of Y travel it had. The spindle would not quite reach the front edge of the table. And I think that was mainly because it just barely reached from the factory. And then when you put a DRO scale on the back, you lose a couple of inches. And that's always the case on milling machines. There's no avoiding that loss of real estate. But most mills have excess Y travel to account for that, and to account for other situations you might want to have a part that needs to stick out a little bit on the sides of the table. So the PM728 has much, much better Y travel. And again, you do still lose a couple of inches from the DRO scale, but you can see I can actually get past the front edge of the table with the spindle. In fact, it'll go a little bit further. I just don't want to crush the weight cover there into the corner there. But yeah, so it'll go past the front edge of the table. And this is another one of those things like the reamers where once you know about it on the PM25, you can plan for it and just be careful where you position your parts and so on. So there's ways around it, but if you don't have to think about it, it's nice. Because there were a few times on the PM25 where I set up a part and then dialed everything in, did my edge finding, and then went to drill a hole out here and I couldn't reach it. And that's frustrating because you've spent all that time in setup. So you're not going to have that problem here. But again, once you know about it, you can plan ahead. Just be careful, check your range of motion before you start dialing in and doing all the setup work. Okay, but this isn't a glowing praise of this machine. This is an honest review video. What are the bad parts about this machine? Now that I've had it for a while now, I've got a lot of hours on it. What has turned out to be not so good on it? Well, I mean, the first thing is, I think what I said in my first unboxing video has remained true. This one-shot oiler it's just garbage. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if anyone from PM is watching this. You guys know I like you, but this is no good. It just doesn't work. And I noticed that right away, and it hasn't gotten better. I've actually just stopped using it. I oil the ways by hand. The idea of these things is that every day when you first start using the machine, you're supposed to be able to just give it one of those, and it puts a little bit of oil on all the slides, and that's your lubrication handled. That's great in principle. The problem is that this thing just isn't functional. For that to work, there has to be no air in any of the oil lines. And you can see, here's the last mile here of lubrication line is this clear plastic tubing. You can see there's no oil in that. And that's because I haven't pumped this thing in more than 24 hours. The system doesn't hold oil. And so the oil just leaks back into the pump. And so every time you go to pump it, you have to pump it 20 times before you get oil up into this part of the system. And then while you're doing that, The other oil lines, which are down low, are staying full of oil because of gravity, and so you're just flooding the whole bottom third of the machine with oil while none is getting up into the upper lines. So I don't know what exactly all is wrong with the system, why this happens. It might need some check valves or maybe some better fittings, or something is bleeding air into the system. I'm not sure, but it just doesn't work. And the opposite problem occurs on the lower half of the system. This is the part of the system that's below the reservoir. If the oil level in this thing is too high, there's a little bit of a pressure head in the tank, and oil just drains down and floods the system. So if you fill this oil tank, 3/4 of the way up, and then go home for the night and come back out into the shop the next day, the level will be back down to here and your bench is covered in oil. So again, there's something missing in the system. Check valves or something that isn't built right, and it doesn't hold static pressure in the system, and it just doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And it's probably fixable. I have not spent any time investigating this because it just, I don't know, for me isn't worth the effort. I just oil the ways by hand. While we're over here, I'll talk about the head lock. I'm not a huge fan of the lock on the head on this machine. The PM25 had double kip handles for locking the head, which felt about right. Like for the amount of cast iron, the amount of weight that it's expected to lock up, 2 kip handles felt right. It was kind of like one here and one here. For some reason, this machine only has one. And I mean, it does seem to work fine. I haven't had any noticeable issues, but I do feel like surely it would be more rigid if there were 2 locks. And I could add one here myself, but again, projects, right? So yeah, I don't know why they have 2 in the PM25, and this mill, which has a much bigger and much heavier head, only has the 1 lock. I think there really ought to be 2. On the subject of head weight, as I said, this mill has a much bigger and much heavier head on it than the PM25. It does have some racing stripes here for lightning, but even with those, it's still a lot bigger and heavier. And that's 99% a good thing. Obviously, you want more mass in the machine. But there is one area where that's arguably worse, and that's when it comes time to move the head. When you go to crank this head up and down, I mean, this thing is heavy. And the hand wheel on this is quite a bit bigger than on the PM25 because they do acknowledge that the head weighs a lot more. I think this hand wheel is about 30% bigger, but I mean, this, that is a lot of work. And one of the things you do the most in milling machine setups is moving the head up and down. And this crank is up high and way in the back. So, you're extended like this, and it's not a super comfortable body position to be using this crank. So I don't know, there's maybe something better that could have been done here on this. Personally, my solution to this was the Priest Tools head lifter. They make one for the PM25, that's this here. You remove this cap off the back of the column, and inside here is a DC motor with a gearbox and a Lovejoy coupling that attaches to the top of the lead screw. And then there's a switch here, and this drives the head up and down with that DC motor. And let me tell you, that is 100,000% better than running that crank by hand. This is quite nice. I mean, this is just a joy. My only complaint about this system is that it is a little bit delicate. It has plastic gears in that gearbox, and it doesn't have any kind of stall protection or interlock or anything on it, any kind of safety clutch that would slip if the forces get too high. So if, for example, you hit this switch while the gib is locked, it'll strip out the gearbox. And I know that because it happened to me once. Greg was very nice about it. He swapped it out for free, but it's something you have to be aware of with this system. So because of that experience, I have a very finely tuned muscle memory system where I never touch this switch without first checking that lock. Even if I know for 100% it's unlocked, my arm automatically goes up there and checks it every time. And that little bit of muscle memory has kept me from ever stripping it a second time. But even with that slight weakness, this system is worth every penny, because holy cow, would you get tired of running this crank up and down. I mean, this crank is, I'm 5'11", I'm pretty tall, and this thing is still, it's up high and it's way in the back, and this is not an ergonomic position. You're also having to bend your arm around the quill handles out here. So this, let me tell you, this gets old real fast. So I would honestly almost consider this to be an essential addition to this milling machine. Another weakness on this machine is the weakness that all hobby machine tools seem to have, and that's the way covers. They're always terrible. Even when they try, they're not good. This machine had no covers at all on the Y way here. This one is the factory one, this neoprene. The PM25 had a neoprene way cover here, so that's better than nothing. But if you watched my PM25 videos, I talked about how it didn't work very well because it was too heavy and it bunched up in here and actually limited the Y travel of the machine. So I actually replaced that neoprene cover on the PM25 with this thin leather one. And then when I got the 728, I did the same thing. This is just, I think this is 2 mil leather, something like that. You can buy little squares of it online or go to a leather shop, and it's just a piece of leather screwed to the machine, screwed to the back of the slide. And I mean, this works perfectly. It's easy to clean, it's indestructible, it's immune to cutting oil and everything else. And yeah, this is something I would do to every machine. On the PM25, I think the vertical way cover was actually better. It had a proper accordion way cover that wrapped around. And for some reason on this machine, again, higher end machine, way cover is substantially worse. It's just a sheet of neoprene, and I mean, you can see chips get in behind it. I mean, it protects the ways fine, I guess, but it's hard to clean, and it, you know, like I said, chips get behind it. I don't know, it's not great. It hasn't bothered me enough to go to all of the effort of replacing it with some other system, but it's definitely not a strong point on the machine. The other big weakness on this machine is this mounting for the Quill DRO. And in fact, this Quill DRO, the one that came on my machine, wasn't great. But so this little bracket here, if you watched my video where I made some improvements to this mill, this bracket was one of them, because the little bent sheet metal thing that was in there before, it had so much movement in it that it made the Quill DRO inaccurate. Like you could just touch this and, well, you can see, well, I'm actually moving the quill there, but here, I'll lock the quill, and you know, that doesn't move now. On the old lock, with the quill locked, you could make the reading move by 4 or 5 thousandths by pushing on that, and then it wouldn't go back to where it was because, you know, the metal wasn't fully springy. So it just, yeah, it made the Quill DRO inaccurate, and it would change while you were cutting, and it was awful. So this was again, I think probably a necessary upgrade, was to replace that chintzy sheet metal with a machined block that does the same job. I did also replace this DRO completely. This is, I have a video on this as well. The one that was in here, I hesitate to comment on it because one of the things on these hobby mills that are made in China or Taiwan, these are the kinds of parts that are often different on all of them. Like depending on where they sourced the DROs from that week, your machine might have a different one in it. And the one that happened to be in this one was pretty awful. The display was difficult to read. The auto power off behavior of it was obnoxious and irritating. And yeah, so I just didn't like it. I replaced it with a different random Chinese one that happens to not have those issues. So that's that. The other thing I didn't like in that same video series was the Quill hand wheel. So this is also an upgrade that I made. The one that was on here was okay. I wouldn't call it a deal breaker. I used it for, I don't know, 1.5 years or something, 2 years before it bothered me enough to replace it. But it was small and kind of a hard plastic coated aluminum that wasn't very comfortable, especially for if you're doing a lot of traversing, like with a boring head or just, you know, rapid setup work. Didn't like it very much. And this larger diameter as well is nice because you can be smoother when you're feeding by hand. For example, with a boring bar, it's a lot easier to be smooth if the hand wheel's larger. So this was a worthy upgrade, but again, not a deal breaker. But interestingly, this is an area where the PM25 was better. It had a nice knurled aluminum hand wheel kind of thing here, thumb wheel / hand wheel. It was a good size for the weight of the spring that's in the quill. And it worked fine. And I used that one for 5 years, never had the slightest complaint with it. This one I replaced after 1 year because it bothered me. The quill spring in this one is heavier than in the PM25, and you really felt it in this fine feed because you're fighting the quill spring when you hand feed, right? And so you really felt that resistance in this mill, and it didn't bother me in the PM25. One of the things that these days I basically always recommend people do, if there's a factory option for an installed DRO to just do it. Mainly because if you can get the factory to do the work of installing the scales for you, that is worth every penny. Because installing scales on milling machines is such a hassle. It's a lot of work. It's never as easy as you think it's going to be. It's difficult to get them all aligned. So it's worth real money to have someone else do that. What I wouldn't necessarily do is order this machine with this top of the line DRO head unit. This is the Mag Exact. It's the top of the line one that PM offers. They have a range of options. And I mean, it's a nice DRO, but I have issues with it, frankly, that at this price point, there shouldn't be issues like this. I think I've talked about this in other videos, but like the big one is these buttons are all kind of flaky. So like, see that? Like I'm pushing that button and nothing's happening. Oh, there it went. You see that? And like you have to push it just right or it doesn't go. Like, yeah, see? Like I'm pushing right in the middle of that arrow and nothing is happening. And oh, then it worked. So yeah, the buttons on it just don't work that great. And I'm not going to quote any prices at you because they change, but you know, this is for the price point of this head unit, it should be better than it is, in my honest opinion. So that said, though, I think it's well worth buying the lowest end DRO that is offered, or maybe ask if they'll just install the slides for you just to get the slides installed. Because again, you know, installing these is frequently difficult and a lot of work. You can see the elaborate bracketry that they've done. And this works very, very well. And you're going to have to do something like this. And don't underestimate how much work that is to do that. It's a lot more work than on a lathe. And installing DRO slides on a lathe is no picnic either. So it's well worth having the factory do that. And then go get your own head unit of a different type. Now, that can be a little tricky because the slides are often made by the same company. And sometimes they're kind of, I don't want to say proprietary, but they are sort of closely designed to work together. So these are this is the Mag Exact head unit, and these are the Mag Exact scales. So you can't just plug any random Chinese DRO head unit into these. What you can do, however, is go get a TouchDRO. This is just a cheapo Android tablet off of eBay, whatever the cheapest one I could get was. And you buy the TouchDRO Bluetooth adapter box, and he's got adapters for basically every set of scales under the sun. And so like on this lathe, I'm using one random magnetic scale from some Chinese website and then one decent quality optical scale on the other slide. And this thing talks to all of them, no problem. And you can get a TouchDRO to talk to the Mag Exact scales as well. So, and the great thing about TouchDRO is that it's by far the best DRO head unit I've ever seen. I mean, not for nothing, because it's working on a top quality modern touch capacitive screen. So guess what? All the buttons work perfectly. And it's got a million options, especially on the milling machine. I've got it in lathe mode here, so it's a lot simpler. But on the milling machine, it's got enormous amounts of options for contour cutting and hole patterns and data management and all kinds of stuff. So it's an awesome system, and because it's software only, he's constantly updating it, and that's something that, you know, the static head units can't do. So this thing gets better all the time just by you sitting here not using it. Sometimes I come out here and there's a new update for it, and it's like, oh, new feature, neat. So I've been going back and forth on replacing this with the TouchDRO just because of the annoyance of these buttons. But the truth is that's the only thing on this thing that actually bothers me. Everything else works fine. It does hole patterns and everything else that I need. I don't have very demanding needs for my DRO on a mill. And other than the buttons, which I've kind of gotten used to, I'm not quite at the threshold yet of replacing it with the TouchDRO, but I probably will at some point. But if I was going to buy this again, I would definitely not buy this head unit. I would buy either no head unit or the cheapest one that they sell and replace it with the TouchDRO. So in the final analysis, what's my long-term feelings about this machine? I mean, in general, I think it's fantastic. This mill has pretty dramatically improved my quality of life in the machine shop. I'm making a lot more parts a lot faster, and I'm enjoying the time a lot more. The value of this large amount of Z height cannot be overstated. Like, it is so nice to basically never have to worry about Z height anymore, which was kind of a constant battle on the PM25, if I'm being honest. And I don't think I have ever run out of Z height on this thing. Like my longest reamer, I mean, again, bear in mind I'm working on small parts, but like my longest reamer is 1/2 inch, and I can get a 1/2 inch reamer in a drill chuck and have my workpiece in here, and it all fits in this Z height. So that is really, really nice. But that said, like I said, the price difference between this and the PM25 is not nothing. And your budget is the most important factor at the end of the day, especially for a milling machine, because milling machines need a lot of tooling, way more than a lathe does. I mean, the amount of vices and rotary tables and fixture plates and parallels and edge finders and all that stuff that you need for a mill that, that are all required equipment before you can even make chips. Should not be underestimated, and you need to spend money to get good quality on that stuff too in a lot of cases. So you don't want to buy a cheap vise. You don't want to buy cheap parallels. So that has to factor into your budget. So if you don't want to stretch yourself too thin to buy this machine because you're not going to be able to buy all the tooling, the PM25 is a great mill. And like I said, I used it for 5 years. I built 6 steam engines on it, and I really had no complaints about it. This was just more a case of once I had the extra Z height, I kind of saw what I was missing a little bit, and life is definitely better. But if that's worth the price difference or not, it's kind of, I guess, a personal decision. That's hard for me to judge because as said in the opening, I did not pay for this machine. So I'm very, very lucky and privileged in that way that I don't have to justify that purchase in that sense. If they had not given me this machine, I almost guarantee you I would still be using my PM25 because it was working fine for me. I'm not a fancy person. I don't need a lot out of life. And the PM25 was doing what I needed it to do for years on end. So I would still have that machine. But that said, I'm also very, very glad to have this thing. And this is a fantastic mill. I think you can't beat it in the hobby market right now, as far as I can tell, especially at this price point. So it's not the cheapest one out there by a long shot, but I do think for the most part, you get what you pay for. Just really wish they'd fix that oiler. Well, I hope that was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks to my patrons who make all of this happen every week. You all are the best. Couldn't do it without you. And I'll see you next time.